They called it the bargain of the century, 40 acres of green pasture and a weather-worn cabin sold for just 10 cents. To Elias Carter, a broke drifter with nothing left but his saddle and his black stallion Midnight, it felt like a miracle. But the land carried more than grass and silence. Midnight sensed at first, ears flat, muscles trembling, refusing to step toward the western ridge. Then came the discovery, a rotting chest buried in the dirt, a journal scrawled with warnings, and a trail that led to secrets powerful enough to destroy a town. What looked like a dream was never abandoned by accident. It was left behind for a reason. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. And if you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe. Elias Carter was 35 years old and carried the weight of twice those years in the lines of his face. He had drifted from ranch to ranch across the high plains, taking whatever work he could, branding calves, mending fences, breaking colts that fought like demons. But no matter how hard he worked, he never managed to keep much beyond a few coins jangling in his pocket. He was tall and wiry, his skin leathered by sun and wind, his jaw shadowed with the perpetual stubble of a man too busy surviving to care for appearances. His dark eyes, however, held a stubborn light, the kind of quiet fire that comes from believing in labor, in freedom, in the right to stand on one's own ground. His past was a patchwork of short-lived jobs and lost chances. Once he had ridden with a small outfit, hired as guns for a border dispute, but the pay was poor and the promises poorer. Another time, he worked the herds of a wealthy rancher who never spoke to him except to curse. Each chapter ended the same, Elias moving on dust in his throat and disappointment at his back. But in the silence of lonely camps and endless miles, one dream kept him alive. He wanted land. Not much, just enough to stake a life that belonged to him, a place where he could build more than a passing memory. That chance came in the unlikeliest of places, a cramped wooden hall in the town of Dust Creek, where the county clerk called out lots of abandoned or repossessed property. On that morning, the benches creaked with the weight of townsfolk and speculators, all waiting for bargains. Elias sat among them with only 10 cents in his pocket, the last of his savings. When the clerk unrolled a yellowed map and tapped a finger on a shaded square of land, the room buzzed. 40 acres, the clerk announced, west of the creek bed. Starting price, 10 cents. The crowd laughed. 10 cents for cursed land, someone jeered. Another man spat into a cup. That's Dawson's old place. Folks say the ground swallows men whole. No wonder nobody's claimed it. The murmurs grew tales of disappearances and strange lights in the hills. Most dismissed the parcel with a chuckle. Who would waste time on a patch that seemed more graveyard than pasture? Elias listened, his face unreadable. 10 cents was all he had left, and the land was said to be worthless. But he felt the pull of destiny, the stubborn whisper that this was his chance, maybe his last. Slowly, he raised his hand. The clerk blinked. 10 cents bid received. Any other takers? A silence answered him. The townsfolk smirked, nudged one another. Look there, the drifter's just bought himself a coffin. The gavel struck wood. Sold. Elias stood, walked to the front, and placed his single dime onto the clerk's ledger. The silver coin looked absurdly small, but the deed that came in return felt heavier than gold in his calloused hands. He turned without a word, ignoring the laughter that followed him out the door. Deep inside, hope surged like water in a dry well. For the first time in years, he owned something that could not be taken from him. Waiting outside was Midnight, the great black horse, who had been his shadow for half a decade. Midnight stood taller than most mounts' muscles, rippling beneath a coat that shimmered almost blue under sunlight. His mane was long and tangled by the wind, his eyes keen and watchful. Elias stroked his neck. "We've got land now, boy." The horse tossed his head, let out a ringing neigh that made a few bystanders glance up. It was as though Midnight himself shared in the victory. Stubborn, loyal, and cunning in ways that sometimes seemed near human, the stallion had carried Elias through dust storms, hunger, and winters that nearly broke them both. Elias trusted the animal more than he trusted any man alive. With the deed folded into his vest pocket, Elias swung into the saddle. Midnight pawed the ground, eager to move. They left the jeers behind and rode out of Dust Creek toward the horizon. The trail westward was little more than a scar in the earth. Dust rose in clouds behind their hooves, coating Elias's throat. Far in the distance, the red mesas burned under the sun, and the grasslands rolled on like waves frozen in time. Every mile carried him further from the noise of the town and closer to the land that was now his. Despite the ache in his bones, Elias felt a cautious exhilaration. He imagined what could be built: a cabin of pine logs, fields of corn swaying in summer, a corral where Midnight could run free. He pictured mornings filled with work that was his own evenings without another man's orders hanging over him. On the outskirts of town, a pair of farmers watched him pass. One shook his head. "Poor fool. That land's nothing but bad luck." The other shrugged. "Maybe so, but he's got fire in him. Sometimes that's enough." Elias heard them, but kept riding his jaw set. Let them whisper. He had listened to whispers all his life. What mattered now was what lay ahead. By the time Elias Carter reached the boundary of his land, the sun was dipping low, spilling copper light across the grass. He slowed Midnight to a walk, letting the horse's steady gait carry him through the last stretch. Ahead, the ranch came into view. It was smaller than he had imagined when holding the deed in town, but no less striking. The cabin stood in the middle of a clearing, a single-story structure with a sloping roof, its wooden walls weathered to the color of ash. The windows were broken, jagged glass, glittering faintly in the twilight, and the porch paint had peeled away in long curling strips. Grass and weeds had grown high, swallowing the fence posts that once marked the yard. To one side, a barn sagged against itself, boards warped and ropes frayed into nothing but string. The air carried the smell of dust and rot, the scent of wood, left too long to the mercy of rain and sun. Near the barn yawned the mouth of a stone well. Its walls were mottled with moss and crumbling mortar, the rope and bucket gone, the circle of earth around it dry as bone. And yet, beyond the ruins, the land itself spread wide and beautiful. Green fields rolled gently toward the horizon, the kind of pasture where cattle could fatten and horses could run. The contrast was jarring life, waiting to be nurtured, tethered to a house that looked as though it had given up. Elias reined Midnight to a stop and gazed around with an expression caught between sorrow and resolve. He could picture how it must have looked once fresh paint on the porch, smoke curling from the chimney tools lined neatly by the barn. Someone had worked this place with pride. Now it was his turn. This land was alive once, he murmured to himself. It can be again. Inside the cabin, silence greeted him. His boots stirred clouds of dust on the warped floorboards. The air was thick, tinged with mildew. He pushed open a door to what might once have been a sitting room. A broken chair leaned against the wall. A shattered picture frame lay face down on the ground glass, scattered around it like frozen tears. Near the barn, he saw a faint marking burned into the wood, the letter D, charred as if branded there long ago. Dawson. That was the name he had heard in town whispered with the land's curse. Elias bent closer, running his hand across the scarred grain. Whoever Dawson was, he had left pieces of himself in this place. An old plow, half buried in earth, leaned against the field's edge. Its iron was red with rust, its handles almost consumed by soil, as though the land itself had tried to swallow the memory of its use. Elias straightened, his jaws set. Someone had planted here, struggled here, believed here, and now it was his responsibility. The deeper he breathed the air of his new ranch, the more he noticed something unsettling. The silence was not the ordinary quiet of country evenings. It was heavier. No birds flitted through the trees. No insects sang their endless songs. Even the breeze seemed reluctant to stir the weeds. Elias stood still in the middle of the yard, listening. The only sound was his own breath and the faint, steady thump of Midnight's hooves shifting against the ground. The horse had gone, rigid ears pricked forward, nostrils flaring. Midnight blew out a sharp breath and stepped back the way a beast does when it senses something the human eye cannot. Elias frowned. "Easy, boy," he said softly, reaching for the stallion's neck. Midnight accepted the touch, but his muscles remained taut. The quiet pressed down like a weight on Elias's chest. The peace he had dreamed of on the ride here suddenly felt like something else entirely, something watchful. Determined to shake off the unease, Elias decided to walk the boundaries of his new property. Leading Midnight by the reins, he circled past the barn and out toward the tree line. The land unfolded in gentle rises, the fields bordered by oaks and cottonwoods. He wanted to see it all, to claim it, step by step. When they reached the western edge, the land tilted upward into a slope scattered with rocks and sparse trees. As they drew closer, Midnight halted. The horse's body stiffened, mane bristling, eyes wide in a way Elias had never seen before. He snorted violently, stamping the earth with such force that dirt scattered beneath his hooves. "What's the matter?" Elias tugged gently on the reins. "Come on now." But Midnight refused to move. He stepped back, shaking his head, and let out a sound that was half growl, half whinny. His tail flicked, ears flattening tight against his skull. Elias frowned, puzzled. Midnight was no stranger to danger. The horse had faced gunfire without flinching, crossed rivers in flood-endured storms that made other animals bolt. Yet here, before a quiet slope of stone and grass, he trembled. Elias squinted at the hillside. The rocks looked ordinary, the trees no different from the rest. Shadows lengthened as the sun slipped lower, but nothing stood out. Still, the stallion's terror was undeniable. Midnight leaned back against the reins, pulling Elias away, refusing even one step closer. "All right," Elias said at last, laying a calming hand against the horse's neck. "We'll leave it be." They turned back toward the cabin. But Elias's mind stayed behind, fixed on that western slope. He had learned long ago to trust the instincts of his horse, sometimes even more than his own. Midnight's refusal was not whim or chance. Something in that hillside was wrong. As they walked back through the field, Elias's thoughts turned to the price he had paid for the land. 10 cents. A gift, people called it, though, with laughter that mocked. If the soil was rich and the pasture broad, why had it been left to rot? Why had no one else taken it? The more he thought on it, the more the answer pressed on him. The land was beautiful because it was empty, and it was empty for a reason. He had not bought peace for 10 cents. He had bought into a story, half buried a tale that others had chosen to leave behind. By the time they returned to the cabin, the light had thinned into dusk. Elias gathered kindling and built a small fire on the porch. Flames licked upward, casting trembling light across the broken boards. He sat beside it, shoulders hunched, the deed folded in his pocket, the weight of it heavier than before. Midnight stood close, restless. The stallion's ears kept turning westward, his gaze locked on the dark line of the hill. Each time the wind stirred, he shifted, muscles coiled, as if ready to bolt. Elias watched him for a long moment, then looked out into the gathering shadows. It felt as though the hillside itself was staring back at him, patient and implacable. He fed another stick to the fire. The flames leapt crackling into the night. "Tomorrow," he said quietly, staring at the west. "Tomorrow we'll find out what's hiding here. Tonight, we'll pretend it's ours." The fire sputtered. The silence pressed close again. Midnight shifted uneasy, and the darkness at the edge of the ranch seemed to hold its breath. Dawn finally spilled through the dusty window panes. He rose stiff and weary, but determined. The light was pale gold, filtering across motes of dust that hung thick in the air. Elias buckled his belt, took up a small spade, and stepped out into the morning. His plan was simple: explore the garden and yard around the cabin, see if there was anything left worth salvaging. The patch that had once been a garden was hardly recognizable now. Grass and weeds had devoured the space, climbing high against the fences, tangling into mats that bent under their own weight. Elias could make out the faint shapes of rows where vegetables must have once been planted, but now only brittle stalks and half-buried stumps remained. The fence posts leaned and splintered, most rotted clean through at the base. In the corner, the remains of what might have been fruit trees stood like sentinels burned by time, blackened stumps with no life left in them. Elias walked slowly, boots sinking slightly into the dew-soaked earth. He carried the spade loosely in one hand, more a marker of intention than a tool at this hour. As he looked, he made mental notes, clear the weeds, cut new posts, maybe plant corn or beans. Once the soil was tested, it would take backbreaking work, but work was the one thing he had never feared. Midnight followed after drinking from the water Elias had poured into a bucket since the stone well was dry. The stallion was restless, his black coat shining faintly in the morning light, his breath steaming. At first, he nosed around the weeds like any horse might, curious about strange ground. But soon his behavior shifted. The stallion lowered his head to the earth, snuffling sharply, then let out a grunt. His front hoof struck the ground, once then again harder. Elias turned, watching with a frown. Midnight's ears pinned back, and suddenly he began pawing the earth in earnest, scraping clumps of dirt aside with violent energy. His breath came fast, his muscles taut, every motion radiating urgency. "What is it, boy?" Elias asked, stepping closer. At first he thought Midnight might have caught the scent of roots or some animal burrowed beneath. But there was nothing casual about the horse's fury. Midnight tore at the soil with a desperation that made Elias's skin prickle. His eyes were wide, nostrils flared, his whole body bent to the task, as if compelled by something stronger than hunger or habit. Elias dropped to one knee, spade in hand, and began to help. Dirt flew under the edge of the blade, mingling with the dark clumps Midnight had already scattered. Together, they worked in silence, man and horse, driven by the same unseen force. After several minutes, Elias's spade struck something hard. He froze, listening, then scraped again. This was not stone. Slowly, he brushed aside more earth until a patch of wood appeared dark and sodden. The smell rose immediately: wet, rot, mildew, the faint reek of mold buried for years. Elias crouched lower, his heart beating faster. He cleared away more soil with his bare hands until the shape emerged the edge of a chest. It was small enough that two men could lift it, though heavy with age and earth. The wood was swollen, its iron bands rusted to the color of blood. The lid was domed, the hinges almost eaten through. "This wasn't meant to be found," Elias muttered. He sat back on his heels, staring at the thing. The ground had not claimed it naturally. It had been buried here on purpose, hidden beneath weeds and time. A shiver ran through him, not from the chill morning air, but from the certainty that he had stumbled into the heart of Dust Creek's curse. Midnight snorted, stamping once more, then stood rigid, head bowed toward the chest, as though demanding it be opened. "All right," Elias said softly. "Let's see." He pulled a knife from his belt, wedging the blade under the rotten hinge. The wood splintered with a groan. Another shove, and the lid cracked, coughing up a stale breath of mildew. Elias forced it open until the chest yawned wide. Inside lay the remnants of cloth, long since rotted to threads. Resting on top were two objects that seemed almost preserved by will alone. The first was a bridle thick leather, worn by years of use. The stitching was careful, almost loving, but the leather was cracked and the buckle green with corrosion. Elias lifted it gently, turning it in his hands. It carried the weight of memory, as though the horse it had once guided still lingered in its straps. Beneath it was a small book, bound in black leather. The cover was warped by damp, but the corners chewed the edge of one side, singed as though by fire. The initials SD were faint, but still visible on the cover. "Samuel Dawson Elias," whispered. He sat back on his heels again, staring at the book. The name carried a ghostly weight. Dawson, the man who had once owned this land, and the man whispered about in town. Elias ran a thumb over the cover, then slowly opened it. The pages smelled of rot, the ink blurred on most words, drowned by years in the soil. But here and there fragments remained. Notes in a neat hand, lists of supplies, brief lines about weather and work. Then further in the writing grew urgent, scrawled in a hurried, uneven script. One page was circled, the ink almost gouging the paper. "Everything lies beneath the lightning-struck elm." Elias read the line once, then again. His brow furrowed. Lightning-struck elm. He searched his memory of the property. Yesterday, when walking the land, he had seen only oak and birch. No elm at all, certainly none scarred by lightning. He turned another page, but the rest was blurred into blue stains. He closed the book slowly, the words searing themselves into his mind. For a long moment he sat in silence, listening to the quiet of the yard. The garden seemed heavier now, the weeds taller, the sky darker, though the sun was rising. He looked down at the bridle, the initials on the book, and felt the cold creep of realization Samuel Dawson had buried this chest with purpose. And the message inside was not idle. Midnight shifted closer, lowering his head to nudge the book with his muzzle. His breath stirred the damp leather, his dark eyes fixed on Elias, as though urging him to understand. Elias let out a slow breath. "So that's it, huh? You wanted me to find this." The horse blew softly, a sound half like agreement. Elias's gaze turned toward the western slope, the place where Midnight had refused to go. He remembered the way the stallion had trembled, the weight of the silence there. Perhaps the elm, if it still existed, stood somewhere on that hill. He ran a hand over his face. The sense of triumph he had felt yesterday when holding the deed was gone. In its place was a heavy awareness, a feeling that he had been handed not peace, but a story unfinished. Samuel Dawson left his words in the dirt, Elias whispered. "And I've gone and picked them up." The air was quiet, save for the dry whisper of the wind sliding over weeds. Shadows from the cottonwoods stretched long across the yard. Midnight stood near the porch tail, flicking at invisible flies, his ears angled toward the western slope, as though still listening for something Elias could not hear. Elias closed the book and rubbed his thumb across the initials on the cover, ESD, trying to decide what he would do with Dawson's final words. The thought was broken by a sound, that cut clean through the silence, the distant rhythmic thunder of hooves. He stiffened instinctively, reaching for the knife on his belt. The hoofbeats drew nearer, steady and unhurried, until a rider appeared on the trail. The man rode a gray horse, its hide dusty, its gait deliberate. The rider himself was broad-shouldered, a figure of authority even from afar. As he drew closer, Elias saw the gleam of a silver badge catching the sun against his weathered coat. The horse halted in the yard, with a practiced tug on the reins. The rider swung down his boots, crunching against the gravel. He was perhaps 50, built heavy through the chest, his face bronzed and lined from years in the saddle. He smiled wide, revealing even teeth, but his pale blue eyes were cold, unblinking. "Afternoon," the man said, voice carrying in the stillness. "Welcome to Dust Creek. Name's Randall Pike, sheriff of these parts." His tone was genial, but his gaze swept the ranch slowly, as if taking inventory, the sagging barn, the dry well, the neglected fences. Then his eyes settled on Elias, measuring him the way a butcher sizes a cut of meat. Elias rose from the step, standing square, though something deep in him urged caution. He tipped his chin in acknowledgement. "Sheriff." Pike dusted his hands on his coat and nodded toward the porch. "Heard a stranger bought up Dawson's land. Didn't believe it till I saw it myself." His grin widened. 10 cents. Wasn't it hell of a bargain? Elias said nothing at first, the weight of the badge reflecting in his mind. At last he replied flat and steady, "It's mine now. I aim to see it lived in again." The sheriff chuckled, the sound echoing off the walls of the empty cabin. Most folks wouldn't touch this place with a stick. People pack up and run from it quicker than a thunderstorm rolling in. "You sure you want to stake your claim here?" Elias met his gaze without blinking. "I've stood fast in places harder than this. If the land can be worked, I'll work it. Nothing here frightens me." For a heartbeat, Pike's smile faltered. Then he laughed loud and long, but the sound rang hollow. His eyes narrowed, studying Elias as though trying to decide if he were brave or simply foolish. The sheriff began to stroll across the yard, boots tapping against the warped boards of the porch as he spoke. He ran a calloused hand across a cracked railing, the gesture almost casual. "Dust Creek's a fine country," he said, his voice sliding into the tone of a storyteller. "But it has a way of swallowing men whole. Folks around here say, if you dig too deep, you don't live long enough to tell what you found." Elias kept his face neutral, though his grip tightened against the journal resting on his thigh. He understood the game. This was no neighborly folklore. It was a warning. Pike's eyes glinted as he went on. "Take Dawson, for example. Man before you. Some say he up and left. Others reckon the land itself took him. Either way, he's gone. You'd be wise not to repeat his mistake." The sheriff's words fell soft, but sharp, each syllable the dull scrape of a knife against bone. Elias answered calmly, though his voice carried a hint of steel. "Any man who disappears leaves something behind. Dawson left signs. I'll find my own truth." For the first time, Pike's smile thinned into something almost sour. All the while, midnight had not moved from Elias's side. The stallion stood tall, muscles tense, ears pinned back. His breathing grew heavy, flanks rising and falling in short bursts. When Pike stepped closer, just one pace too near, midnight erupted. His hoof struck the earth with a force that cracked the ground. He snorted, flaring his nostrils, eyes blazing with red fire. Then he reared his head and gave a sharp, cutting whinny that echoed across the yard. The sheriff stopped. For an instant, something flickered in his gaze. Annoyance, maybe even fear. Then just as quickly, he smirked. "Your horse doesn't care for me. Smart animal. Knows when to keep its distance." He tilted his head toward Elias, just like its owner ought to. Elias laid a steadying hand on Midnight's neck, fingers brushing through the coarse mane. The stallion trembled under his palm, but the message was clear. He trusted the horse's judgment more than the sheriff's charm. Pike lingered at the porch, his eyes drifting toward the dry well, then the collapsed barn, as though tallying up the bones of the Dawson ranch. The sunlight caught his badge flashing silver across the yard. "Word of advice," he said, voice low and smooth. "Curiosity don't keep a man alive out here. The less you pry, the longer you breathe." The wind stirred, lifting dust across the ground. Elias said nothing. His gaze held firm, quiet, but unyielding. For a long moment, the only sound was the horse's sharp breaths and the faint creak of wood. Finally, Pike straightened, setting his hat back onto his head. His broad smile returned all friendliness again, though it stopped well short of his eyes. "Well," he said lightly, "I've said my piece. Welcome to Dust Creek, Carter. If you need help, you come find me. I'll always be around." With that, he mounted the gray horse and turned toward the trail. The animal's hooves beat a steady rhythm as they rode away, throwing up a cloud of dust that hung in the air long after he was gone. Alicia stood in the yard, the journal heavy in his hand, Midnight restless beside him. He watched until Pike vanished behind the trees. Only then did he let his shoulders drop, the air escaping his lungs in a slow, measured breath. The sheriff's farewell had been words of welcome, but Elias heard the truth buried beneath it was not an invitation. It was a threat. The evening after Pike's visit fell heavy on Elias. The sheriff's warning had lodged itself in his chest like a splinter. He sat at the table in the cabin, Dawson's journal open beside the bridle. His fingers traced the initials on the book's cover again and again, as if the motion might summon the man who had written them. Outside, Midnight shifted in the yard, restless ears twitching toward the west. Elias was still weighing his next step when the faint sound of hooves reached him again, lighter this time, hesitant. He rose, knife instinctively in hand, and peered through the broken window. A rider approached, but not with the swagger of Pike. It was a woman on a chestnut mare, her figure straight in the saddle despite the long ride. She drew rein in the clearing and swung down with practiced ease, boots striking the earth. Dust clung to her clothes, and her face was drawn, but her movements carried a quiet determination. Elias stepped out to the porch wary. Midnight gave a sharp snort, stamping once, but not in alarm, more in acknowledgement. The woman raised her chin. "Are you Elias Carter?" "I am," he answered evenly. "My name is Clara Dawson," she said. The name hit him like a bell tolling. Up close, she looked younger than the hardness in her features suggested, perhaps late 20s. Her face was narrow, marked by travel and strain, but her eyes were clear and sharp-lit with the steady fire of conviction. There was a resilience in the set of her jaw, a refusal to yield. Elias said nothing at first, watching her. Clara Dawson, the blood of Samuel Dawson, the man who had left behind the journal buried in the dirt. Clara met his silence head on. "You bought this land. It used to belong to my brother." Elias nodded once. "Samuel." Her expression flickered at the sound of the name. "The sheriff says he left, that he gave up and went elsewhere. But I don't believe it." Her voice steadied, each word cut clean and deliberate. "My brother was not a man who walked away from a fight. If he's gone, it's because someone made sure of it." The words settled between them, heavy as iron. She explained why she had come. For months, Clara had followed the county's public notices, waiting for the Dawson property to reappear. When she saw it listed for auction, when she read that it had been sold, she knew she had to return. "This land is the only place left that might hold the truth," she said. I couldn't stay away, not once it passed into new hands. Not when there might still be something here of Samuel. Her conviction stirred Elias in a way Pike's threats had not. She had no tangible proof, only instinct and the scattered whispers of townsfolk. But she carried herself like a woman who had lived too long with grief to mistake it for false hope. People in Dust Creek talk when they think nobody listens, Clara continued. They say Samuel had found something about barren mining, that he discovered they were burying more than ore in these hills. The mention of the mining company snapped Elias's attention sharper. He remembered the journal's lines about poisoned water, strange notes scribbled in the margins. He thought of the bridle preserved alongside the book, like an anchor to Samuel's life. Barren mining, Elias repeated quietly. Yes, Clara said. If Samuel was silenced, it was because of them. She reached into her satchel and pulled free a leather pouch, untying it carefully. From within, she withdrew a faded photograph. The paper had curled with age, the image blurred in places, but the scene was unmistakable. Samuel Dawson, younger than Elias had imagined, stood in the picture with a broad smile, one hand resting on the neck of a powerful chestnut horse. Around the horse's head gleamed a bridle, sturdy, hand-tooled, patterned with a distinctive design. Elias knew it at once. Clara held the photo out at her fingers, trembling slightly. This was taken the year before he disappeared. That bridle, he made it himself. He never let it out of his sight. Elias turned without a word and stepped back into the cabin. When he returned, he carried the bridle he had unearthed from the chest. He laid it carefully on the porch railing between them. Clara's breath caught. Her hand rose as though of its own accord, brushing the cracked leather. She closed her eyes. When she opened them again, they glittered with tears. This is it. This is my brother's work. I'd know it anywhere. Her voice wavered, but the resolve beneath it hardened. He would never have abandoned it. If this is here, it means Samuel never left of his own will. Something happened, right here. Elias watched her closely. The grief in her touch was raw, but her will was unshaken. This was not a woman chasing ghosts. It was someone following a line that pointed straight to truth. Clara drew a long breath and steadied herself before continuing. She spoke of Samuel's nature, a man who loved the land, who spent long hours studying the creeks and soil, who believed nature carried warnings if one paid attention. He told me the water here had changed, Clara said, voice low. He said it tasted like metal, that animals were sick livestock dying without reason. He thought barren mining was dumping waste, poisoning the ground. He was gathering proof. She swallowed hard, her jaw trembling. And the last time I saw him, he told me, if I don't come back, look at the ranch. Everything I know will be there. The words struck Elias like a hammer blow. Everything under the lightning-struck elm. Samuel's writing in the journal now carried a new weight. Clara leaned closer, her voice taut. Now you understand why I'm here. He left something behind. And if barren mining killed him for it, I won't let it stay buried. Elias listened, the fire of her conviction echoing against his own reluctance. He had come here only for solitude, for a chance to rebuild a quiet life. But the chest in the garden, the journal in his hands, and now Clara Dawson standing on his porch had bound him to something larger. At last he spoke. His voice was low, deliberate. I didn't know your brother. But I know this much: Sheriff Pike doesn't want me looking deeper. That tells me there's something worth finding. And I'm not about to walk away. Clara searched his face. Whatever she saw there made her shoulders relax. She nodded, the hard glint of determination in her eyes softening just for a moment into something like gratitude. A soft sound interrupted them. Midnight, who had lingered just beyond the porch, moved forward with slow, deliberate steps. His dark eyes were fixed on Clara. Elias watched, ready for a flare of suspicion like the one the stallion had shown Pike. But Midnight's posture was different this time. His ears eased forward, his head lowering as he came near. He sniffed at Clara's hand, then pressed his muzzle gently against her shoulder. Clara let out a soft breath, tentative at first, then reached up to stroke his mane. Midnight stood still under her touch, then nudged her with a low, approving rumble. Elias allowed himself the barest smile. "He trusts you," he said quietly, "and I trust him more than anyone." The moment sealed itself like a pact. Midnight's acceptance was more binding than signatures or oaths. Clara Dawson was no longer a stranger. She was an ally. Night deepened over the ranch as the three of them lingered on the porch. Elias packed away the journal carefully, but the weight of it no longer felt solely his. Clara spoke little after that first torrent of truth, but her presence itself was an anchor. For the first time since he set foot on Dust Creek land, Elias felt less alone in the fight he had not chosen, but could no longer ignore. The fire inside the cabin flickered shadows, stretching against the walls. Outside, the wind stirred across the western slope, carrying with it a silence that was less empty than it was waiting. In that silence, Elias Carter knew two things. Samuel Dawson had left behind more than whispers. And with Clara's arrival, the search for that truth had truly begun. Morning came gray and heavy, as though the sky itself bore witness to the secrets hidden beneath Dust Creek. Clouds pressed low, the kind that smothers sunlight instead of breaking into rain. Elias emerged from the cabin carrying a spade across his shoulder, his knife sheathed at his side. Clara followed, lantern in one hand, a coil of rope slung over the other. They had spoken late into the night, weighing Samuel's words against the bridle, against Pike's warning, against the gnawing unease they both felt. By the time the fire burned low, they had agreed Samuel's journal was not a collection of ramblings. It was a map, and they needed to test it. The starting point was clear. The well. It sat behind the cabin like a relic of another time. Stone walls crumbling, mottled with moss, its rope and bucket long since rotted away. Weeds clustered thick around the base, and the air that drifted up from its throat was stale, tinged with the scent of old earth. Elias stopped beside it, gazing down. Midnight lingered several yards back, nostrils flaring, ears laid back. This was the heart of the Dawson Ranch, Clara said, her voice soft but steady. Water is life, and if Samuel wrote about the well, then whatever killed him may have started here. Elias found an old iron bucket leaning in the weeds, its handle bent but serviceable. He tied it to the rope Clara had brought and lowered it carefully into the blackness. The rope hissed against stone as the bucket descended. For long moments there was nothing, just the sound of rope sliding. Then splash, faint and shallow. He drew the bucket back up, arms straining until the rusted rim broke into daylight. Barely a finger's depth of water sloshed inside, murky and discolored. The liquid was not the clean silver of mountain springs, but a sickly shade of brownish yellow, as though rust itself had bled into it. Elias frowned and set the bucket down on the grass. Clara crouched and dipped a finger in. She lifted a drop to her lips before Elias could protest. Her face twisted immediately, eyes narrowing. "Metal," she said hoarsely. "Sharp, like iron filings." Elias knelt beside her, grim. He lifted the bucket toward Midnight, offering it as he might in any normal day's work. The stallion recoiled at once, jerking his head away, ears pinned flat. He snorted violently, pawed the earth, and swung wide in refusal. His entire body radiated rejection. Clara looked back at Elias, her expression caught between sorrow and vindication. "Samuel wrote about this," she whispered. "He said the water changed after storms, that livestock fell sick after drinking it. He knew something was bleeding into the earth." Elias let the bucket spill onto the dirt. The water seeped away, sluggishly staining the soil, as though reluctant to vanish. They spread Samuel's journal across a cloth on the porch, anchoring the corners against the breeze. Many of the pages were ruined ink, blurred into meaningless swirls, but some lines had survived. Clara read aloud, her voice shaking only slightly. March 14th? Rain all night. Well water reeks of rust. Cattle sick within the day. She flipped carefully to the next legible entry. April 2nd. Dead fish floating in the pond. Followed runoff ground unstable near the western slope. She closed her eyes, pressing the heel of her hand against her forehead. He was trying to warn me. He was following a trail. Elias leaned over the page lips, pressed tight. The handwriting was hurried but clear, a man documenting not only what he saw, but what he feared. Elias remembered Pike's words about Dawson vanishing and felt his jaw tighten. "Your brother didn't walk away," Elias said quietly. He was closing in on something. Something Barron Mining didn't want him to find. Clara's hands shook as she folded the journal shut. Her grief was raw, but beneath it glimmered the iron of determination. Midnight stood nearby, still restless, his gaze fixed toward the west. The stallion shifted from hoof to hoof, every breath sharp as if he could smell the corruption in the air. "Then we follow," Elias said at last. They packed the journal, rope, lantern, and spade, then struck out across the yard. Elias led with long, ground-eating strides. Clara matched his pace, eyes constantly scanning the terrain. Midnight trailed close, head low, as though hunting something unseen. The land west of the cabin changed quickly. Where the fields behind the barn still managed some patchy green here, the grass grew thin, brittle, yellowing at the tips. The ground undulated strangely shallow dips and rises that looked less like natural hills and more like the land itself was sagging inward. Elias crouched, scooping a handful of soil. He rubbed it between his fingers, then lifted it to his nose. A sour, metallic stench clung to the dirt. "Not right," he muttered. "Soil shouldn't smell like this." Clara knelt beside him, prodding the ground with a stick. The dirt collapsed easily, revealing loose stone beneath that empty space. A hollow. She sat back hard on her heels, breath catching. "There's something beneath us." They pressed onward. Within 100 yards, they found another depression, deeper this time. Edges cracked. Weeds there were brittle, their roots failing to take hold. Beyond it, another, and another still. By the time they marked the third, Elias stopped, hands on his hips. He looked back across the line of hollows, tracing them with his eyes. They formed a path not random at all, running in a crooked line straight toward the western slope. "It's not the land giving way," he said, his voice low and grim. "It's a tunnel, a mine." They dug under all this, and when it collapsed, the soil followed. Clara's face paled, but her eyes burned brighter. Samuel was right. Barron Mining buried something here. Midnight had grown agitated, stamping the ground, head fixed toward the ridge where the blackened skeleton of a tree jutted above the canopy. Its branches were scarred, one trunk split, as though lightning had once torn it apart. Clara followed the horse's gaze and whispered, "The elm." The western slope rose before them like a challenge carved from stone. The air grew colder as they climbed, though no clouds broke to spill rain. Midnight walked ahead, ears pricked each step, cautious but determined. It was as though the stallion remembered the place where he had balked days before. Yet now, sensing Elias's resolve, he pressed forward, every muscle taut with restrained tension. The trail narrowed, weaving between boulders and gnarled roots. Dust sifted under Elias's boots, and Clara, lantern in hand, though the day was still young, kept close behind. She glanced often at the journal tucked into her satchel, as though the words within were guiding her as surely as the horse's instincts. At last, the slope broke into a plateau, and there it stood, the tree. The elm was unmistakable, even in its ruin. Its trunk was silver-gray bark, peeled away in great sheets, with a black scar tearing down one side like a lightning bolt, frozen in wood. Its branches reached upward, brittle and skeletal, as though caught forever mid-cry. Clara drew in a sharp breath. That's it. Samuel described it just like this. Elias felt the weight of every note, every scribbled line in Dawson's journal pressing on him. The message was not cryptic anymore. It was a marker pointing them exactly here. Beneath the elm, the ground was choked with moss and layers of fallen leaves. Midnight halted, lowering his head, and then scraped at the soil with a hoof. The sound rang different, hollow, not the muted thud of earth. He pawed harder, nostrils flaring, until the moss peeled back to reveal the dull glint of metal. Elias dropped to one knee, brushing away debris with his hand. The surface emerged square, flat, rust-streaked. A steel hatch, edges sealed by packed dirt and stubborn roots. At its center was a round wheel handle, scarred with age, but intact. Clara knelt beside him, her breath quickening. Her fingertips hovered above the cold steel, as though touching it would break some spell. He was right, she whispered. Samuel was right. There's an entrance. Elias didn't answer immediately. His gaze swept the perimeter, his instincts kicking harder now. This was no relic simply left to rot. It had been hidden deliberately. Too deliberately. He circled the hatch slowly, crouching low. Something caught his eye, a faint line in the dirt, a disturbance that was too neat to be nature's work. He brushed carefully with the spade until a thin wire gleamed under the soil. Stop, he hissed. Clara froze, lantern held tight. Elias pinched a bit of dust and tossed it lightly across the hatch's edge. For a moment, the air shimmered, catching on something invisible. Two faint red beams flared briefly before vanishing again. Clara's throat tightened. A tripwire. Or worse, Elias muttered. An alarm. He traced the wire to a small junction box, nailed crudely to a rock half hidden beneath ivy. With a swift tug of his knife, he cut the line. The red glimmer faded. Silence returned, thick and absolute. Clara exhaled shakily. That means someone's been here. Recently? Elias nodded grimly. This isn't just an abandoned mine. It's active. Somebody's still using it. He returned to the hatch, gripping the wheel. The steel was stiff, groaning under his weight, but at last it turned. The seal broke with a hiss, exhaling a breath of stale air, so sharp it stung the nose. A sour chemical tang wafted upward, mingled with the damp musk of earth. Elias pushed, and the hatch swung wide with a shriek of tortured hinges. Below, a flight of concrete steps plunged into darkness. Moisture gleamed on the walls, and the air rolling up was cold, metallic foul. Clara lit the lantern, the flame quivering but steady. Elias tested the first step with his boot. Midnight balked, ears flat, muscles trembling. Yet when Elias moved forward, the stallion followed reluctantly, his loyalty outweighing his fear. The trio descended shadows, stretching long across the slick walls. At the bottom, the stairs opened into a cavern. Elias halted, stunned for a moment by the sight. The chamber was massive, carved from stone and reinforced with beams of timber that had long since gone soft with rot. Yet overhead, electric bulbs dangled on wires, their light weak but alive. Power still flowed here. The glow revealed neat rows of crates stacked along the cavern floor. Wooden boxes, burlap sacks, barrels, all marked with numbers scrawled in chalk. Beyond them, the mouth of the old silver vein yawned, its walls braced with rusting girders. The tunnel was sealed with fresh planks and chains transformed into a storage wall. Clara clutched the lantern higher, her voice cracked in awe and dread. This isn't a silver mine anymore. They've turned it into a warehouse. Elias stepped closer, senses alert. The air reeked of fuel and dust, but beneath it all was something sharper, explosives. He pried open the lid of the nearest crate with his knife. Inside lay rows of wrapped sticks, each marked with faded warnings: dynamite. Another box held sacks of coal dust, a dangerous accelerant in the wrong hands. Still another contained ingots of silver ore, half smelted, bearing the unmistakable stamp of Baron Mining. Christ, Elias murmured. They're storing contraband here. Clara moved swiftly from crate to crate, her hands shaking but sure. She pulled papers from a box, shipping ledgers, inventory sheets, all stamped with the Baron Mining insignia. This is proof, she whispered fiercely. Dates, quantities, signatures. It's all here. Her hands fumbled in her satchel until she drew out an old box camera, worn leather casing, scuffed from years of use. She set the lantern down, adjusted the focus, and began clicking photographs, the crates, the silver ingots, the ledgers. Each flash of light was a rebellion against the darkness that had swallowed her brother. Elias watched her work, feeling a swell of respect. She was not a wanderer chasing ghosts. She was a woman finishing a fight her brother had started, and she carried herself with the same unbending spine Samuel must have had. Clara jotted notes furiously in a small book, copying numbers from the manifests, sketching the layout of the cavern. Sweat beaded on her brow, but her eyes burned with fierce light. This, she said almost to herself, is what Samuel gave his life for. And he was right. Elias looked at the crates again, at the humming wires feeding the light overhead. His gut twisted. If this place is still active, it means someone will come back. Maybe tonight. Maybe tomorrow. We won't have long before they know we were here. Clara's jaw tightened. Then we make every second count. The sound came as they reached the hatch. A sharp metallic clack followed by the slow, dreadful spin of the steel wheel handle slamming back into place. Elias froze, hand still on the lantern Clara carried. Then came the sound that hollowed his gut, the toll of a bell deep and resonant, echoing through the tunnels. Not a church bell, not anything noble, just a lump of iron struck again and again, carrying the alarm far beyond the mine. Elias cursed under his breath. Damn it. Clara's face drained of color. We've triggered something. They triggered it for us. Elias cut in his voice, low but hard. He seized her arm, guiding her in midnight back toward the stairs. The stallion balked, nostrils flaring, but Elias forced them up. When they burst into the evening air, he shoved the hatch shut. The iron shrieked, then sealed, but the damage was done. Somewhere, somehow, Pike knew. Clara pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. We've given ourselves away. No, Elias said grimly, sliding the spade back over the camouflaged steel. We've given them a chance to bury themselves. We've got the proof now. Let's see how far they'll go to keep it quiet. They returned to the ranch in silence, the sky darkening with the onset of night. The cabin crouched in the clearing like an old sentinel, its walls silvered in the dying light. Clara collapsed onto the porch steps, clutching the journal. Elias pried up a loose plank inside the floorboards and slipped both Samuel's notebook and the stolen papers beneath, hiding them from the first sweep of intruders. "They'll come." Clara whispered, her voice brittle. "You know they'll come." "I'm counting on it," Elias answered. Midnight prowled the yard, like a restless ghost, hooves striking sparks against stone, tail whipping. Every few strides, he stopped, ears snapping upright, nostrils flaring toward the tree line. Once he pawed the earth so hard, Elias thought he might split it. The horse smelled what the humans could, not the slow, inevitable approach of danger. It began with the thunder of hooves. From the eastern road came the glow of torches, the grind of wagon wheels. Elias extinguished the lantern inside, leaving the cabin cloaked in shadow. He crouched near the window, peering through the crack. Sheriff Randall Pike rode at the head of the procession on a broad, gray horse silver badge, gleaming even in the torchlight. Around him clustered at least 6 deputies' rifles glinting. Behind them rattled a wagon, heavy with supplies, or corpses if Pike had his way. The sheriff reined in, raised his voice. "Elias Carter, Clara Dawson." His tone was grandiose, theatrical. "You fancy yourselves bloodhounds, sniffing in other men's affairs, then know this Dust Creek don't suffer the curious. Step outside and I'll make it quick. Stay in there and you'll burn alive." His men laughed cruelly. Clara clutched Elias's hand, knuckles white. He kept his gaze steady through the crack in the wall. Midnight shrieked a piercing, furious neigh that rang across the yard. The stallion reared on the porch hooves, slamming down with the promise of violence. "Hold your ground," Elias murmured. Outside, Pike gave the signal. The deputies spread, forming a loose circle around the cabin. Shots rang into the air, bullets tearing through shingles and timbers. Splinters showered onto the dirt floor. Clara ducked, clutching the journal tight against her chest. "They're not here to bargain," Elias muttered. "They're here to erase." He shoved her beneath the heavy oak table. "Stay down." From the rack by the hearth, he pulled a battered rifle, old but serviceable. He worked the bolt, the metallic clack swallowed by the pounding of his heart. The first true siege of Elias Carter's new home had begun. Night thickened torches painting jagged light across the clearing. Outside, the deputies shouted, jeering, their boots crunching against the dirt. Elias tracked each voice, each movement, mind calculating angles and distances, as though back in the war. The window behind him shattered. Glass exploded inward, and a man crawled through the frame like a spider. Clara screamed, muffled by her own hand, as the deputy seized her, wrenching her upright. A blade flashed silver, pressed against the hollow of her throat. "Got the girl," he bellowed. Elias whirled, rifle raised, but the deputy dragged Clara into his line of fire. One twitch of the trigger, and she'd fall first. From the yard, Pike's voice boomed, "Bring her out, Carter, and maybe I'll let you limp away." Clara's eyes found Elias's across the room, wide with terror, but steady pleading. The rifle in his grip quivered. He needed another option. It came in the form of thunder. From the shadows of the stable, midnight surged forward, a black tempest. The stallion hit the deputy with the force of a battering ram, shoulder slamming into ribs. Man and knife flew apart, Clara collapsing free to the floor. The deputy stumbled, scrambling for his blade. Midnight rose forelegs, pawing the air hooves, striking down like hammers. The man's eyes widened in primal fear. Elias fired once. The deputy dropped still. Smoke curled in the cabin air, acrid and final. Clara pressed against the floorboards, sobbing with shock, but alive. Midnight stood before her mane, bristling, snorting, as though daring anyone else to try. Elias's voice was calm, but ragged. "Stay behind him." Gunfire erupted outside, slamming into the cabin walls. Elias returned fire through the splintered shutters. Each shot met with a deputy's shout. The old timbers shuddered under the assault, groaning like a wounded beast. Clara scrambled to pull Midnight fully inside, barricading the windows with chairs, benches, anything she could move. Still, Elias knew they wouldn't last. "Walls won't hold," he muttered. "Not against fire." A roar answered him, Pike's men smashing at the front door with rifle butts. Hinges screamed under the abuse. Dust rained from the rafters. The cabin was dying around them. Elias crouched near Clara, forcing her eyes to his. "We can't keep the ranch. We have to break out. They'll be waiting," she argued desperately. "The moment we step outside, they won't expect how Elias said." He nodded toward Midnight. He'll open the path. The plan was mad desperate, but it was the only one. He lashed a rope to the porch's support beam, fastening it to the harness strapped to Midnight's chest. The stallion pawed at the ground as if he knew what was being asked. Clara's face was pale, streaked with soot. "We'll be killed." "Not if we move fast," Elias answered. Outside, Pike's voice bellowed again. "Burn it down!" The first flames caught at the corners of the cabin, fire licking upward with greedy fingers. Heat pressed inward, suffocating. Clara coughed, covering her mouth with her sleeve. Elias didn't wait. Now he roared. Midnight lunged forward, muscles coiling, then hurled his full weight against the northern wall where the deputy's net was thinnest. Wood splintered. Posts cracked. With a final shriek of nails, the fence and half the wall burst outward into the dark. "Go!" Elias dragged Clara by the wrist. She stumbled through the smoke-choked gap, clutching the satchel against her chest. Bullets whined, sparking off stone, but she pressed on Elias, a shield at her side. Midnight bounded alongside them, larger-than-life flanks gleaming with sweat. He cut between gunfire and Clara, his very body serving as armor. Behind them, the cabin roared in flame, casting their shadows long across the ground. Pike sat astride his horse, the fire's glow painting his features in hellish red. His eyes burned with murderous intent. "Run them down," he thundered. The deputies obeyed, spreading out like hounds on the scent. Elias could hear them fanning left and right, circling. He spat into the dirt and pushed Clara harder. "Keep behind me," he said, voice low but steady. She nodded, jaw tight. Her hands fumbled at her satchel until she pulled free the old revolver Samuel had once carried. The gun felt heavy in her grip, but she thumbed the cylinder with trembling resolve, loading cartridges with clumsy fingers. Torches flared through the trees. The hunt had tightened. They burst through a dry creek bed, stones grinding beneath their boots. Elias yanked Clara across before the hounds of Pike's deputies could close the trap. The air was alive with their shouts, the clatter of hooves, the snap of branches. Somewhere a dog bayed the sound, slicing through Clara's spine like a knife. Her breath came ragged. "They're closing, then we move faster." Elias's voice was a growl. Hours passed in a blur of roots and shadow, their lungs seared by cold night air. At last, a pale glow spilled across the horizon. The trees parted, and Red Mesa rose before them, an immense wall of stone, its sides sheer and scarred, its crown gleaming silver beneath the moon. Clara gasped, awe breaking through exhaustion. Samuel wrote of this place. He said patrols pass by the ridge. Elias lifted his chin, eyes sharp. "That's our beacon. We get to the top and light it. They'll see." Midnight gave a low whicker, tossing his head, as though he understood. But behind them, the glow of torches flickered through the forest edge, the deputies breaking from the trees like wolves. The chase was far from over. The climb began at the base of the mesa, where a narrow trail spiraled upward, etched by centuries of wind and hooves. Elias led the way, rifle across his back, every sense taut as wire. Clara followed close, her skirts catching on jagged stone. Midnight brought up the rear hooves, striking sparks on the path as he climbed with grim determination. Every slip of gravel tumbled into a void below, swallowed by silence. From far behind came Pike's bellow carried on the wind. "No use climbing Carter Mesa, I'll be your grave." His men roared with him, voices carrying up the slope. The sound pressed against Clara's chest, but she clenched her jaw and climbed faster. Wind howled across the cliffs, tugging at their hair, shrieking in their ears. The higher they climbed, the more the world dropped away. Below, the forest spread like a black ocean. Above, the stars glittered like scattered steel. Elias gritted his teeth. "We reach the top, we live. Nothing else matters." The summit broke into a plateau strewn with boulders and dry scrub. Elias scanned it with a soldier's eye, one entrance trail, little cover, but a clear view for miles. It was a killing ground and a beacon. "Wood," he ordered. Clara was already moving, gathering dry branches, brush anything that would burn. Her hands shook, but her movements were quick, efficient. Elias knelt beside her, striking flint against steel. Sparks kissed the tinder smoke coiled upward, and within moments, fire roared to life, orange tongues clawing the sky. Clara tore a strip of cloth from her dress, lashed it to a stick, and raised it high, waving furiously toward the horizon. The flame lit her face, fierce and desperate. "Someone will see," she said, voice raw. "They have to." Elias adjusted the fire, feeding it, making the smoke rise thick and black. "We just need to hold until they do." He turned toward the trail. Pike's men were already climbing their torches, bobbing upward like a line of fiery ants. The siege of Red Mesa began in a storm of lead. The first deputy crested the trail, rifle raised. Elias fired before the man could breathe. The deputy tumbled backward, torch spinning into the void. Others surged behind him, bullets ricocheting from the rocks. Clara ducked behind a boulder, fumbling more cartridges into her revolver, her hair wild in the firelight. Midnight thundered at the edge of the plateau. Ears flat, eyes red with fury. When a deputy charged too close, the stallion lunged shoulder, slamming into the man's chest. The deputy screamed as he cartwheeled down the slope, rifle spinning into the dark. The air filled with smoke, firelight, the crack of gunfire, the screams of men and beasts. Red Mesa itself seemed to tremble with the violence of it. Elias moved like a machine, firing, reloading, firing again. Clara covered him, her shots shaky but true. Midnight raged like a creature from myth, his hooves splitting stone. But ammunition runs dry, and courage alone does not fill chambers. Elias's last cartridge snapped into place, and then was gone in a crack of thunder. He threw the empty rifle aside, yanking the iron rod from his pack. It gleamed like a spear in the firelight. The next deputy lunged, knife in hand. Elias swung the rod, connecting with a crunch that sent the man sprawling into the abyss. Another came. Elias pivoted, slammed the rod into his jaw, and sent him tumbling. Clara fired the revolver, her shot tearing through a deputy's shoulder. He howled, fell back, clutching the wound. She gasped for air, her knuckles bloodless against the grip, but she did not falter. Sheriff Pike did not rush in. He watched from the trail, eyes glinting like knives. He let his men grind themselves against Elias's fury, waiting for the moment the veteran's strength would falter. Elias met his gaze across the plateau. They both knew the end would come down to them. The fight surged around the fire sparks, rising with each clash. Clara raised the signal flag again, desperate to be seen. The fire roared higher, a column of smoke stabbing the night sky. She never saw the deputy crawling through the brush until it was too late. The man leveled his rifle from behind a stone outcropping barrel, aimed square at Clara's chest. His finger tightened on the trigger. Elias spun at the last second, eyes widening. He shouted, but the gun barked before he could move. Clara flinched, certain the world had ended. And then midnight struck. The stallion hurled himself across the plateau, a black missile of muscle and fury. His body slammed the deputy full force, the rifle cracking skyward. The bullet seared harmlessly past Clara's arm, grazing her skin, but sparing her heart. The deputy screamed as midnight's impact launched him backward. His torch spun into the void. Then he was gone, his voice cut short by the endless dark below. But victory came at a cost. Another shot rang out, too close, too true. Midnight lurched, a horrible sound tearing from his throat. Blood sprayed across the firelight, dark against his black coat. The stallion crumpled onto one knee, then staggered, fighting to rise. Clara's scream tore through the night. She dropped the revolver and fell beside him, clutching at his mane. "No, no, please don't you leave us now." Her tears cut streaks through soot as her hands pressed futilely against the wound. Elias's heart cracked. He had seen men fall, comrades broken, but this was different. Midnight had been more than a horse. He was the pulse of their fight, the living proof that loyalty could face down death. Elias stepped forward, planting himself between Clara, the wounded stallion, and the encroaching line of torches. His grip tightened on the iron rod until his knuckles split. His voice came like a growl of thunder. "You'll go through me before you touch them." Sheriff Pike advanced, slow and deliberate, his revolver gleaming cold in the firelight. His voice was flat, merciless. "Your horse is done, Carter. Now it's your turn." For one desperate instant, Clara thought the mesa would be their tomb. Then light. From the far horizon came a glimmer, first no more than a star that moved against the grain of the heavens. Then another and another. Torches, many torches, spilled across the valley floor like a river of flame. The sound followed the low thunder of hooves, the shrill echo of a bugle cutting through night. Elias's chest heaved. His grip tightened on the iron rod, not from fear this time, but from relief that trembled at the edges of disbelief. Finally, he muttered, voice raw, "Someone saw." Clara blinked tears into the firelight. "The marshals." Midnight staggered, but planted his hooves, head bowed, yet unbroken. The stallion's wound oozed his body, shuddering, but he would not lie down. He stood as if to say he would meet whatever end came beside his master. The marshals arrived like a storm given flesh. A dozen riders crested the far ridge, their coats long and dust-gray rifles gleaming. At their head rode a man broad of shoulder with iron in his jaw and eyes sharp as a hawk's. His voice cracked across the mesa like a whip. "Hold your fire." The torches of Pike's men wavered. Deputies stumbled uncertain, their bravado dimming. The lead rider raised a shining badge that caught the firelight, U.S. Marshal. His voice carried authority, older than any town, any sheriff. "By order of the federal government, you will lay down your weapons. Now." Marshal Reeves. The name spread like rumor through the deputies, mutters snapping into silence. A few dropped rifles immediately, fear loosening their grips. But Sheriff Randall Pike only laughed, a cruel rasp that echoed against stone. He stood with revolver still trained on Elias, lips curling. "They won't take what's mine," Pike snarled. "Not Barren Silver, not Dust Creek, not my town. Not now, not ever." The shot came sudden as a lightning. Pike's revolver barked fire licking from its barrel. Elias was already moving, instincts forged in harsher places, snapping to life. He ducked, rolled, and surged upward in the same breath. The bullet screamed past his ear-grazing hair. His iron rod came down like a hammer across Pike's wrist. Bone cracked. Pike howled, the revolver spinning away into the dirt. They crashed together at the cliff's edge, boots scrabbling on stone fists, grappling in the fire's glow. Elias, Clara cried, but she dared not run forward, not with the drop yawning just beyond. The men fought like wolves, teeth bared, sweat mixing with blood. Pike's strength was brutal, the desperation of a man with everything to lose. But Elias fought with something stronger, the quiet rage of a man who had endured, who had lost, who had finally found something worth protecting. They rolled iron rod pressed to Pike's throat. Elias's knuckles whitened as the sheriff's eyes bulged. One shove, one twist, and Pike would tumble into the abyss. Marshal Reeves's voice thundered from behind. Enough, Carter, stop. Elias's breath came ragged. He looked into Pike's eyes, saw the corruption, the cruelty, the years of unchecked power. Every instinct screamed to end it here. But then Reeves's words cut deeper. Let justice work, Elias hissed through clenched teeth. Justice doesn't live in Dust Creek, Sheriff. But maybe it still lives out there. He loosened his grip, shoved Pike backward into the waiting arms of the marshals. They dragged the sheriff down iron, clamping his wrists, his curses drowned by the crackle of the fire. The mesa shifted in sound. The battle was over. Marshals spread like a tide across the plateau, rifles leveled. Deputies who had fought only moments before now fell to their knees, hands raised. A few tried to run. Shots cracked, echoing into the night, and they dropped crying out in pain. Others surrendered their weapons, faces pale with the sudden knowledge that the law they had mocked had finally arrived. Clara collapsed against a stone, clutching Samuel's journal to her chest. Her breath came in sobs, not of fear, but of release. Reeves strode across the firelit plateau, heavy boots grinding stone. He lifted the papers Clara had protected, thumbing through them with eyes gone grim. The barren mining seal gleamed on every page. Damn them, Reeves muttered. This goes beyond Dust Creek. This is interstate theft, contraband murder. They'll burn in a federal court for this. Clara pressed a shaking hand to her mouth. She whispered as if to Samuel himself, "You didn't die in vain." But not all battles were over. Midnight lay on his side now, the strength gone from his legs. His breaths came shallow, each one rattling like broken glass. Blood matted his dark coat, and the fire painted his body in shades of shadow and ember. Clara knelt beside him, her hands pressed to the wound, her tears streaking his mane. "Stay with us, Midnight. Please don't leave us." Elias knelt at the stallion's head, one hand cradling it, the other smoothing the sweat-slicked forelock. His voice was soft, almost breaking. "Easy, boy. You've carried us this far. Don't you quit now." A marshal knelt beside them, a leather satchel at his hip. "I've worked vet detail before," he said quickly. His hands moved deftly, binding cloth tight around the bleeding shoulder, stitching with thread that shook in the firelight. Midnight's body jolted, a sound torn from deep in his chest, but he did not strike out. He trusted. Minutes bled like hours. Then at last, the stallion's heaving slowed. His sides rose steadier, his breath still shallow, but no longer fading. Clara brushed tears from her eyes with blood-stained hands. Elias bowed his head until his brow pressed against Midnight's whispering words only the horse could hear. Marshal Reeves stood over them, his voice low with respect. "That animal's braver than half the men I've ridden with." Elias lifted his gaze. "He's family." The night stretched into interrogation and order. Deputies were bound and lined in rows, their weapons heaped useless at their feet. Some spat curses, others begged for mercy. A few, trembling under the marshal's glare, spilled everything. Words tumbled out in frantic bursts. Sheriff Pike had been the gatekeeper, the shield behind which barren mining thrived. He let their wagons pass, let their men dig deep where no surveyor would check. In return, he was paid in silver, in powder, in promises of power that reached beyond Dust Creek. And Samuel Dawson. Samuel had stumbled too close to the truth. He'd seen the poisoned water, the dead cattle, the hidden shafts. He'd written it all down. When he threatened to speak, Pike had silenced him. His body was never found, but in the confessions that night, the story became clear. Samuel had been taken into the hills, buried where his voice could not rise. Clara wept as the truth spilled out, every word, both wound and healing, yet her eyes shone with a fierce fire. "He fought them," she whispered. "He gave everything so the world would know." And now it does. News of the trial spread like wildfire across the territory. Barren mining corner, once thought untouchable, was dragged into court under the weight of damning evidence. Their assets were seized, their leaders stripped of wealth and power. Headlines in every frontier paper branded Pike and his deputies as the perfect cautionary tale of small-town corruption. Where whispers of dread once haunted Dust Creek's saloons and porches, laughter now dared to return. Fear loosened its grip. People raised their heads when they walked the street. And at the ranch on the western edge of the valley, once Samuel Dawson's land bought by a cowboy for 10 cents, it was life, not silence, that took root. For the first time in years, Elias Carter and Clara Dawson could sit on the porch without the shadow of a rifle's aim pressing on their backs. For the first time, they could breathe without bracing for danger. The ranch itself rose from ruin like a phoenix. The cabin, once a sagging skeleton, was rebuilt with fresh pine boards. The roof gleamed with red tiles, catching the morning sun like fire. The porch stretched wide and welcoming, no longer a lonely threshold, but a place for voices and stories. The corral was mended, its white fences stretching bright against the sea of green grass. The barn doors swung smoothly on their hinges, no longer rotting, but sturdy, ready to house a herd. The old stone, well poisoned and cracked, was sealed forever. In its place, Elias and Clara dug a modern shaft, clear water rising cold and pure. Clara tested the bucket herself, cupping her palms to sip. She smiled relief, breaking over her face like spring. "Clean," she whispered. "As it should be." Neighbors from town visited, astonished by the transformation. Where they had once seen decay, they now saw proof that Dust Creek could heal. The ranch was not just a home. It was a testament, a symbol. Dawson's name and Carter's hand had stitched it together into something stronger than either could alone. It was Clara who first voiced the thought neither had dared to say aloud. "We can't keep this place only for ourselves," she said one evening as children's laughter carried faintly from the road where orphans played. Elias, leaning against the porch rail, nodded slowly. He remembered faces of drifters, veterans like him, who carried their scars with no roof to rest under. He remembered children he had seen begging scraps outside Dust Creek's saloon, their eyes hollow and wild. They need somewhere. Clara continued, her gaze steady. And Samuel, he would have wanted this land to mean more than one family's survival. Elias's voice was low, but there was conviction in it. "Then we'll open it. Let the orphans come. Let the old cavalry boys have a bed. We'll teach them to ride, to work the land. Give them more than silence. Give them a home." And so it became more than a ranch. It became a sanctuary. Children learned to brush manes and ride bareback. Veterans mended fences with steady hands, finding rhythm in honest labor. The sound that once haunted the valley, gunfire and whispers, was replaced by laughter, hammering, and the cheerful calls of children chasing one another through the grass. Midnight was the center of it all. His wound had scarred silver across his shoulder, a reminder of the night on Red Mesa. But he was alive, his spirit untamed. On mornings when the sun spilled gold over the valley, Midnight would rear on the hilltop, his black mane flying hooves striking sparks against stone. The children adored him. They clung to the fence rails, shouting his name in chorus. Midnight, midnight. Their voices rang pure, echoing across the pasture. Clara leaned on the rail, her eyes bright. He's proof, Elias. Proof that loyalty can outlast death itself. They'll never forget what he did. Elias watched silently, the lines of hardship on his face softened by something rare pride. He reached for the scar on the stallion's shoulder, his voice husky. He carried us through the fire. This land stands because of him. Midnight tossed his head, as if hearing every word, then broke into a gallop across the wide field, the wind itself chasing in his wake. The people of Dust Creek changed with the land. Neighbors who once locked their doors at sundown now came bearing gifts. A farmer arrived with sacks of seed corn, a carpenter with beams of fresh lumber, a widow with 2 horses too wild for her to keep offered freely to the ranch. The transformation was infectious. Where fear had silenced the town purpose, now bound it together. Old cavalrymen raised new stables, their hands steady as they drove nails. Orphans planted flowers around the porch, their laughter carrying into twilight. The ranch was no longer haunted. It was alive, and through it, Dust Creek was reborn. One evening, as the sun bled into gold behind the mesas, Elias and Clara sat side by side on the porch. The children raced across the yard, chasing one another, while veterans sharpened tools near the barn. Midnight grazed lazily nearby, his dark body shining like obsidian under the dying light. Clara's voice was soft. Samuel must be smiling now. Elias leaned back, folding his arms. He sowed the seed. We just gave it the water. For a long while, they said nothing more, only listening to the hum of life around them, the creak of the porch swing, the shouts of children. Dust Creek was no longer a refuge for ghosts. It was a place of belonging. And in that silence, Elias realized this was no longer simply Samuel's ranch, nor Carter's, nor Clara's. It belonged to all of them. One afternoon, with the ranch gathered together, Elias rose to his feet. His voice carried across the yard, strong and unshaken. This land carried silence for too long, he declared. Now it will carry laughter again. Applause thundered. Children shrieked with joy. Midnight lifted his head and let loose a cry that rang clear and strong, going off the valley walls like a benediction. Clara's eyes glistened. She knew those words were not just for the people gathered, but for Samuel, for herself, and for the land itself. Dust Creek was no longer cursed. It was home. The dawn that followed was brighter than any Elias had seen in years. The first rays poured over the mesas, gilding the ranch in a river of light. The grass shimmered with dew, the fences gleamed white, and the red tiles of the roof caught fire under the sky. In the pasture, Midnight galloped Maine, streaming his scar, a silver streak that blazed when the sun touched it. Clara stood at Elias's side, a circle of children clustered around them. Some leaned on the fence, others clutched the cowboy's sleeves, their eyes wide with awe as the stallion thundered across the plain. Elias's arm brushed Clara's. She did not step away. Together, they looked out over the valley, no longer burdened by shadows, but lifted by hope. The day was beginning anew. Dust Creek had been scarred, poisoned, nearly silenced. But like Midnight, it had risen again, stronger, scarred but unbroken. The stallion reared into the golden sky, his cry soaring with the dawn. And in that sound was everything Dust Creek had become: loyalty, defiance, and a promise that this land would never fall silent again.